Thanks to everyone who's joining right now. We're just going to give it another 30 seconds to a minute to let the Zoom room fill up. Okay, some people are still joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So, welcome to today's panel, hosted by the Quincy Institute, called At Home and Abroad, the Evolving Role of the U.S. National Guard. I think it's a very timely panel. If you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, it's a think tank based in Washington, D.C. that advocates for a foreign policy more rooted in restraint and that focuses more on diplomacy. And today we're joined by really a top tier panel. And I'm going to go through and introduce them in no particular order. First, we have Dr. Andrew Wiest. He is a distinguished professor of history and founding director of the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society and the Center for the Study of the National Guard at the University of Southern Mississippi. He's taught at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, and the U.S. Air Force Air War College. And he also has books including Vietnam's Forgotten Army, which was an award-winning book, Rolling Thunder in a Gentle Land, and The Boys of 67, which inspired the Emmy-nominated National Geographic documentary Brothers in War. Um, we're also joined by Brigadier General John Conley, who is Director of Administrative Services at the Arizona Department of Emergency and Military Affairs, where he oversees personnel, finance, and mission support for the Arizona National Guard. He was a member of the TAG Council's State Strategic Engagement Working Group. He helped shape national policy affecting the Guard, and he was commissioned through Army ROTC in 1992. He's also served as a JAG in South Korea and Germany before transitioning to the reserves and the National Guard. And part of this panel will be getting into the difference between those types of units. Um, we're not yet joined by Professor Rachel Van Landingham. Hopefully, she'll join soon. She was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and now she's a national security law expert and a tenured professor at Southwestern Law School. And she was also a JAG. And last but not least, we are joined by retired General Brigadier General J. Joy Robinson. Um, and he served as president of the National Guard Association of the United States from 2017 to 2024. And before that, he was executive director of the National Guard Association of Mississippi. And that's the largest National Guard state association in the country. And he began his service as an enlisted soldier in 1983 and was later commissioned through ROTC. Um, and of course, I'm the deputy director of the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute, but I wear two hats. I'm also the director of the Veterans and Foreign Policy Initiative. And the point of this initiative is to get more veteran voices informing our policy debates in this country and make sure that veterans have a seat at the table uh, when decisions are being made in Washington and other centers of power in this country. So without further ado, let's get into it because the National Guard has been in the news recently. And I think, you know, this country has a proud history of military service. We're an all-volunteer military. There's positives and negatives to that. I think one of the positives is that we have, in my view, the most professional military in the world. And we have an enthusiastic base of recruits because they volunteer. Nobody forces them to do it. The cost of that is that we have a society that I think is largely detached from the military and doesn't understand how the military works. And I think most folks don't even know the difference between officer and enlisted, let alone what the National Guard is. So maybe Professor Wiest, I know you just taught a 15-week course that got into the nuances of what the National Guard is. Maybe you could reduce that 15 weeks to a few minutes and tell the audience what is the National Guard.
Sure. Thank you for having us today. I do agree it's a timely panel. It's one of the reasons we founded the Center for the Study of the National Guard here at the University of Southern Mississippi is that, just like you said, um, very few people in this country, other than people who serve in the National Guard, actually really know what it is. When all these things were happening, we were getting calls from um, uh, media outlets, and they wanted to know thing X, but they didn't know the basic building blocks. So the National Guard in this country grew out of the fact that we were British colonies. The British, infamously or famously, depending on which side of that war you were on, had a very professional navy, but they didn't like an army very much. So they relied on a militia system dating all the way back to the Anglo-Saxons. And of course, that transplanted over here. And we didn't have a national army. We relied on local militias, state militias, colonial militias in this point. When the Constitution came along, it was the number one thing that the constitutional framers argued about was about the nature of the military, because they were very afraid that a standing military could be used in the way that George III had used it, in a tyrannical way. And thus the founders kept the greatest amount of American military power in the states, in the state militias that were essentially governor controlled, but could be called up for national service in times of need. This began to change really as America began to enter the world stage. If you follow our early wars using the militia, sometimes those went a little sideways at the beginning because the militia was pretty spotty. And they went really sideways in the Spanish American War, which resulted in the Dick Act of 1903, really moving things over to a more federal control of the Guard. And I would argue law since then has continued to inch that way. So the National Guard, state controlled, local, but especially as America has needed a more international military presence, has moved a little bit more to the federal side. You're muted.
Well, you know what? It's only been like something like five. Oh, sorry. I'm unmuted now. Okay. I was about to say it's only been 5 years since COVID and I still don't know how to use Zoom. But I'll get there. Uh, so I was going to ask a follow-up question, which is, when you go into a military unit headquarters, you always see the chain of command. You see the president, the secretary of defense. You see their you see their photos up, on the wall and the chain of command. What does the chain of command look like in a National Guard HQ?
I'm actually going to defer to General Conley on that one because he's in the National Guard chain of command. And I bet you those pictures are up in his office.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And before I get started, just as a disclaimer, since I am a lawyer, my opinions and my views are my own. They don't reflect those of the Department of Defense of the state of Arizona. And then one other point of order, I guess. My apologies, I didn't update my bio, Adam. I very recently, I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, was named by the Arizona governor as the adjutant general, the commanding general of the Arizona National Guard. So funny that you mentioned the picture because they just changed them outside my office. So it goes President of the United States, the governor of Arizona, me, and then my senior enlisted leader.
And that's a very kind of unique, first of all, congrats on the promotion. But that's a very unique chain of command compared to, for lack of a better way to put it, the regular military.
Yeah, and it's a little bit deceiving because it's not really the chain of command. If you were going to make an org chart, the president and the secretary of defense would be president above, secretary of defense below. On the other side, equal, governor, adjutant general, because states are sovereign states and governors are the commanders in chief of their state militias, their national guards, just as the president is the commander in chief of the active component military.
Now, when you say they're equal, does it depend in terms of who has authority to give orders, what the status is of the National Guard unit at any given time?
Uh, they're at rest. They're completely equal. So the president is the commander in chief of federal troops. The governors are commanders in chief of their state militias, their national guards. Uh, Depending on how a soldier or an airman is brought to duty, They may work for the president or they may work for the governor. They're never going to work for both at the same time, except in one very rare circumstance that we probably don't need to talk about. So, yes, status is everything in the National Guard. And just so that we're all working with the same nomenclature, status means, are you in a state status or are you in a federal status? And there's a couple of different kinds of state status. But are you in a state status under the command and control of the governor? Are you in a federal status under the command and control of the president? And then there are authorities, laws, that decide whether you're going to be in one status or the other.
Now, can you give us maybe a couple examples of what a state status would be versus a federal status?
Sure. So at rest, which is the way we describe ourselves when we're not federalized, as we all know, the president federalized 4,000-ish California Guard members in the last couple of weeks. So those would be federalized troops. They're now no different than a soldier at Fort Benning, Georgia. When 10 seconds earlier, they were a member of the California Organized Militia, the California National Guard. So a state status would be you're either in state active duty status, meaning the governor has decided to bring you on full time to do something that the state needs, and you're going to get paid with state dollars. You're going to be subject to state law. You're not going to get the federal benefits. You're not associated with the federal government at all, except you wear one of these get-ups that happens to say Army or Air Force on it. Other than that, you are a state employee, essentially. You can also be in a state status under Title 32 of the United States Code, federal law, but that law essentially funnels money to the states so that the governor can use that money to pay the National Guard, his or her state militia, to train to the standards of the federal Army and Air Force. So you're still under the command and control of the governor, but you're getting paid with federal dollars. It does not, however, legally make you a federal soldier or airman. You're still in a state status.
I'm gonna take it to General Robinson for a moment. I think when the general public thinks about the National Guard, and even the other services think about the National Guard, they typically think about it in state status, and they typically think about the National Guard in the context of disaster relief, filling sandbags, things like that. But the National Guard is in federal status, does deploy overseas, and the National Guard actually has a storied history in combat. So I'm wondering if General Robinson could walk us through some of the deployments abroad that the National Guard has participated in.
So you can go back. I mean, I think to start with, the most important thing is the transition from a state status to a federal status. Usually takes place kind of on a curve. And in this particular case, you could have soldiers and airmen who may be doing some training in preparation for a mobilization or a deployment in a state status up until the point in time to where they're actually federalized. And at that point, they go on federal orders. And at that point, they begin their final training to include usually some type of a mission readiness exercise that would end their training and would send them over to wherever they're going to be deployed at. I mean, if you look back at the history of the National Guard, I mean, they've deployed just about everywhere in the world. I think the most visible, obviously, is the last 25 years and what the Guard has been asked to do in several overseas theaters of war. But for the most part, that history goes back a long, long ways, actually since the inception of the National Guard. So there's, although the visibility of it today is very much focused on the recent deployments, that's been going on for a long time in the National Guard.
I can't help but notice you have one of our panelists' books behind you, which I think I forgot to introduce that book, which is Dogwood, which is about the National Guard war in Iraq. So if anyone wants to do a deeper dive, they could read that book by Andrew Wiest. Uh, you know, what are the challenges of deploying into combat abroad as a National Guard unit? Because you don't get to, have control over your enlisted soldiers or airmen or whoever all the time the way that active duty does. You don't you don't get to have constant training. These are people who have to maintain full-time jobs and live civilian lives much of the time, but then they do have to be ready to deploy in combat. And as General Connolly said, they have to train up to the standard of the active duty military. But what are the challenges that come with that?
Well, you're exactly right in terms of when the guard is at risk, as General Connolly mentioned. The commanders don't have direct access to their service members all the time. Um, but that changes upon mobilization. So, and there's always, most of the time, I say always, but it's highly likely that a guard formation is going to have some time to do some very intensive training prior to a deployment or a mobilization, specifically on the Army side, and for the most part on the air side. So I guess the way that I want to kind of case it is, the truth is that those guard formations have exactly the same problems and the same issues that their active formations have that are preparing for a deployment. Their timelines are just brought very closely sometimes, but in terms of um, do we face any different challenges? We do, but the truth is it's very similar to our active counterparts. Um, I say it all the time. Maybe a couple of hundred years ago, you could see the difference between a member of the militia or the National Guard of that day compared to today. Senior leaders will tell you, no matter where they go, whoever they interact with, they can't tell the difference between a member of the Guard, a member of the Reserve, and a member of the active component. And I think that goes back to what I'm talking about. That once you're mobilized and you're deployed, it all looks very similar.
Hey, Adam, do you mind if I weigh in on one thing right quick?
Yeah, sure.
You you mentioned the National Guard in history, and the National Guard's participation in U.S. wars has been deep and thorough and far too often overlooked. In the first wars America fought, it was our militias that we threw in first while we raised an army because we didn't like having a standing army. But even after the Dick Act in World War One, National Guardsmen essentially made up half of our military force and suffered just under half of our casualties. Same in World War II. If you go to the most famous spot of Omaha Beach at Verville Draw, that was National Guard that made it to the top of that cliff. In the movie Saving Private Ryan, of course, the captain's a ranger, but those guys with him are National Guardsmen who aren't wearing the ranger tab. And once again, National Guardsmen suffered about half the casualties in World War II. Same with our deployments in the 21st century. The National Guard in Iraq and Afghanistan made up about 40% of our overall deployments to those countries and suffered over 500 killed. So the National Guard is always doing the same thing that the regular military is, often less ballyhooed.
And Adam, if I can chime in quickly as well, I completely agree with everything that Andrew and Roy have said, and I'll tell you from a practical perspective, there's no difference in the training requirements between the active component and the National Guard. So even though the majority of our folks purportedly only work 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, it seems like a lot more than that, I'll tell you. Even though they only work part-time, they have the exact same standards. They have to fly the exact same number of hours in rotary wing and fixed wing aircraft in order to stay current. They have to shoot the same targets at the range. They have to have the same physical fitness standard. And frankly, ours is a little better than the active component. So we have all the exact same standards. We're just required to do it in a truncated time. So folks may ask, well, how do you do that? One, go guard. We're pretty good. Number two, if you look at an active component unit's training calendar for the year, you'd be surprised how many days on that calendar aren't devoted to training. When you take out the 30 days of leave that everybody gets and all the 4-day holidays and this, that, and the other, all the weekends, the delta between how many days a year we're training and how many days a year they're training gets to be pretty close.
Well, yeah, of course, General. I'm speaking as a former enlisted Marine. There's plenty of time spent re-cleaning things that have already been cleaned. Uh, but To add to that, something I've noticed about the reserves and the National Guard is that there's a certain longevity too. I mean, when you look at the active duty military, there's a high rate of turnover, and a lot of people just do one enlistment. You don't necessarily get someone who, let's say they're a staff sergeant, who's done 4 deployments over 12 years because they stayed in, where you do see that in the reserves and you do see that in the National Guard. And I wonder if that's a particular asset that the National Guard does have.
Absolutely. So just on the air side, our pilots have far more flying hours than the average active component pilot. We have a better retention rate with our pilots than the active component has. Frankly, costs about half as much money to keep a fifth generation aircraft ready to go and piloted in the National Guard than it does on active duty.
So I'm wondering if I can turn back to Dr. Weiss for a moment, and maybe you can talk about this other hat that the National Guard has worn historically, which is responding to civil unrest, responding to national disaster, responding to protests that are considered civil unrest, things like that. How historically, how has the Guard been used in that way?
Well, I'm from Mississippi, so you're safe after the hurricane when the National Guard shows up. I mean, it's just a part of life that the National Guard has always taken part in relief efforts throughout the country. Of course, in the earlier iterations of the National Guard, it was essentially, as a militia, almost a state police force, as well as the country was getting its legs under it. But I suspect what you're kind of leaning towards there more is the use of the National Guard in civil unrest and civil disturbances, and that has happened quite often in this country, all the way from Shays Rebellion at the beginning, all the way till California just a few days ago. And the normal situation, of course, normal has quotation marks around it because you're often outside the norm if you're going to call out the National Guard for a civil disturbance. The normal situation is that it's called up by the governor for a state disturbance, whether it's protest, whether it's a prison riot, whether it's strike breaking. I mean, the National Guard was used as strike breakers very early in our history, especially around the World War I era. However, there's of course also instances in which the president calls up the National Guard, and those have sometimes been very controversial in this country in a constitutional sense, because originally in the Constitution, the president did not have the authority to call up the military. In Article 1 of the Constitution, that falls to Congress. It's the militia acts that follow the Constitution, when it becomes clear that the president needs a little more authority as commander in chief, that alter those things. Of course, the biggest thing that changes, two big things, is the Insurrection Act of 1807. As we're hurtling towards the sectional crisis, it's felt that the president needs more power to stop that sectional crisis from coming. The Insurrection Act of 1807. And then, of course, in the Civil War, they try to pull that back a little bit, because under that Insurrection Act, Lincoln is able to take charge in the Civil War. Under the Insurrection Act, he is able to, well, not he, but Johnson and Grant are able to undertake Reconstruction in the South using a military force. And so this is why you get the kind of shot back the other direction called Posse Comitatus, which is passed, the Posse Comitatus Act, which is passed in the wake of the Civil War, which takes some of that power back. But even in that kind of gray area, the Guard has been called out both by the president, sometimes with the governor's authority and sometimes without. And I can certainly get into the difference there if you like.
Yeah, why don't you? I'd appreciate it if you get into the difference, because I think that's something that's being debated today without much context.
Sure, it's a shame that our fourth panelist isn't here, because this is right up her alley, and I was going to kind of check to her power on this one, but I'll try to fill in. The National Guard being called out under the Insurrection Act has taken place 30 times in this country, from the Civil War up through the bonus marchers in the wake of World War I, who are wanting their back pay, but again, very controversially. In that case, the riots in the wake of the assassination of King in '68 was another major example of that. But again, in those cases, the president and the governors are usually on the same page. Where we really get at some interesting cases, in my view, about presidents calling out the National Guard over the governor's objection are in civil rights cases in the 1950s and 60s. In 57, the integration of the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor tried to have National Guardsmen stop integration, and Eisenhower flipped that on him by federalizing the Guard. And the Guard obeyed Eisenhower, not Governor Faubus in this case. Same thing in 62 in Mississippi with the integration of Ole Miss. In this case, it was Governor Ross Barnett who wanted to keep Ole Miss segregated. In this case, it was Kennedy that reversed the script on him, and the Guardsmen obeyed Kennedy in the Oxford riots of '62, and a very similar situation in Alabama the following year with Wallace. So in those cases, you get Guardsmen federalized and sent in, and in the case of Oxford, it turns into a 2-day battle in the streets. Interestingly enough, the Mississippi Guard unit was commanded initially by William Faulkner's nephew. So there are these instances in which the president calls out the National Guard, the state governor doesn't agree, and it's been decided in the courts that the president has that authority.
That is very interesting. And I think, unfortunately, a classic American trait is that we don't know our own history. So whenever something happens in this country, we think it's the first time it's ever happened. Um, I'm going to turn it over to General Robinson. You know, uh, do you ever worry about a crisis of command in the National Guard? When you look at the divisions that have emerged in this country and you look back at your career in the Guard, do you, do you worry that there could be a serious standoff between a governor and the president, or some scenario in which the Guard itself were to fracture, or is that something that's overhyped?
So I think it is a little bit overhyped. I have to tell you, the thing that helps me not to worry are historians like Dr. Weiss that are able to go back in time. The truth is there are very few things that happen for the first time. It may be the first time that we see it in our generation, but most of those roads have been walked down earlier. He made some great examples with some of the civil rights issues that happened. I'm most familiar with the one in Mississippi, and you have to put that in context. That's why the status that the service members, the members of the National Guard are mobilized under is so important. Governor Barnett literally mobilized the Mississippi National Guard to go up and prevent a minority student from entering into the University of Mississippi at Ole Miss. Um, Literally on a phone call, those service members who were in a state status and were protecting the entrance of Ole Miss to keep anybody from entering, their status changed and they were federalized. And the commanding general that was in charge of the exercise turned around and he took off his hat where he was working for the governor and he put on his hat where he was working for the president. And they federalized that entire formation, and the soldiers turned right in place and actually escorted the minority student into the university. So when General Connolly was talking about the importance of status and what the status is that the soldiers and airmen are actually mobilized under, that's why it's so important. Some of the missions that we take on, especially in our own country, which sometimes, as you know, is even more sensitive. It's very, very important that we know who we're working for. There's no ambiguity. Nobody's confused. And the truth is, a lot of the discussions that you hear both in the media and other places when these things are hyped because of a particular incident, that a little bit of that is some political theater, as you know, that are being driven by both sides of the aisle. The truth is, the service members, the members of the National Guard, the traditional soldiers who are actually make up those formations, they're not in those discussions. They're focused on what status am I in? Who is my leadership working for? Is he working for the governor today or the president today? And you can't do both. And I think that's part of the reason that you see so much discussion within the National Guard about the importance of the status that you're in. And it's continued to evolve. I think John Connolly mentioned, we didn't have what we call a dual status commander now as little as 8 or 9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. That is an officer who can be a member of the National Guard, but can actually be put in command as a dual status commander and command both active forces and state forces in the same operation in the same state within the boundaries of the country. And I will tell you, just as an example, the book that you mentioned, Dogwood, that Dr. Weiss wrote, whenever the 150th was mobilized and deployed, I happened to be the battalion commander of that formation. When I was in Anbar Province during that period, the task force that I commanded had members of the National Guard, actually had active Marine Corps, and actually had a lot of active component from the Army that were a part of my task force that were under my command in Anbar Province in 2005. So there's a lot more clarity. Thankfully, we have military lawyers that keep us between the rails as commanders out there. But I do think that's the benefit of the Guard and the law and the benefit of history on the clarity of the status that we're in.
Thanks for that. When I think one of the real benefits that the U.S. military has across the board is the NCOs, and I think that's what keeps things so organized, and that's what keeps command and control um, uh, so constant. Somebody mentioned Saving Private Ryan. One of the great scenes in that movie is when the gunny brings the privates back into line. The privates challenging the captain, and the gunny says, "You're going to listen to your captain." It's a little more dramatic than that. I think he threatens to shoot the private, but we'll leave that aside. But I do think that speaks to the role that NCOs play. But I'm going to direct my next question to General Conley. When I was in the military in the early 2010s, it didn't feel as divisive politically as it does now, and social media wasn't quite as strong as it was now. And I'll be honest, I didn't really know the politics of my fellow Marines. I might know if someone was leaning conservative or not. A lot of enlisted Marines were frankly apolitical and didn't really think about politics. You certainly didn't see, you didn't see these TikToks with soldiers and Marines in uniform. You didn't see them, the kind of comments they might make online. It is my sense that the country as a whole is more politically activated now, and surely that must be true in the Guard. So my question to General Conley is, how do you keep the professionalism in the Guard? Is it true today what General Robinson said that, folks understand what is their status? I mean, does your 19-year-old PFC, or I know the ranks are different in every branch, but is your 19-year-old junior enlisted a soldier or airman, do they really understand these things? Is it the NCOs who are making them understand it? Or are they just listening to orders and not asking questions? How does that work?
Sure. Great question. So we draw our soldiers and airmen from from the pool of 18 to typically 25-year-olds in the country. So yes, they come with all of the experiences that every other 18 to 25-year-old has in the country. And at this particular point in time, there is some divisive rhetoric that tends to go on. Dr. Weiss could probably tell us it was better or worse 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Depending on your perspective, was it more or less divisive in the 1700s than it is now? But for those soldiers and airmen, we make it clear to them when they come in, and we get training every single year. on the importance of the military staying apolitical. You may have your own personal views. You're certainly free within limits, depending on the status you're in or what missions you're performing, to express those views. But we make it very clear to them that it's important to stay apolitical. That's how we maintain uh, our position as kind of the neutral political actors. So as General Robinson said, we can be in a position where when the president says, hey, I'm flipping you from state to federal, you just turn around and now you're doing a whole different mission. And we train that through our NCOs to the younger folks over and over and over again. Every year we get a briefing on, hey, it's election season. Here are the things you can say. Here are the things you can do. There are many, many laws that prevent us from doing things. For example, it's illegal for me in this uniform to go work at a polling station. I can't even really be anywhere near a polling station. So there are laws and safeguards, and we train our soldiers on those things just as we train them on other behaviors that we need them to exhibit throughout their career.
Adam, you mind if I jump in on that one too, a little bit historically?
Sure, go ahead.
To me, the Mississippi Guard deployment in 62 is, if you're going to look at a Guard unit that might not want to obey what the president is telling them to do, it might be this Guard unit. In 62 in Mississippi, the Guard as a whole was 1% African American at the time. The Truman's desegregation order at the just after World War II didn't apply to the National Guard. That was a federal thing. So this is a largely white unit, and don't mean to think on their behalf, but given the time, you've got to think most of those guys would be on the governor's side, not on the president's side. And yet, when the president told them to, they did it. And just a few days ago in California, if I had to think, a California National Guard unit might have a little more liberal leaning than some other states, but they did what the president told them to in this case. So again, I think in both cases, you see the apolitical nature of our military holding firm. And we have to hope it stays that way, because that is, in my view, historically, that is the thing, among many other things, but that's one of the biggest and most important things in the U.S. military, is that it does not become political. In fact, in some wars, it has worked against us because we have a hard time understanding nations we're working with whose militaries are very political. We have a hard time kind of dealing with that. Ours isn't, and since the Civil War really hasn't been. And it's one of the great strengths of both the Guard and the regular military in this case.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true with the Iraqi and some of the Afghan units who were either sectarian or had allegiance to particular politicians more than a sense of the country. And I think those are really important parallels you just drew. We do have a question from the chat that I want to ask, which is uh, someone asks, is the National Guard more skilled than military active components at the federal level in terms of proximity to local population? So, for example, the human and relational component inside the US. And I think what they're really trying to ask is, I mean, these are citizen soldiers in a sense, and the National Guard has a lot more face time with protesters, with civil unrest, with helping people after a hurricane. Do you think the National Guard is particularly suited to that mission? I mean, right now, for example, I'll make it a little more provocative. There's some active duty Marines who are out and about in California, and I I would say that those Marines probably don't, I would say it's probably uncomfortable for some of them to be in uniform holding a weapon out in LA because that's not what the Marine Corps is trained for. But that is what the National Guard does. Do you think the National Guard is better suited for that kind of stuff? Anyone can answer this one.
So I'd like to weigh in if you don't mind, Adam. I do think that there's some uniqueness to the National Guard that makes them probably a little more capable when it comes to those types of missions. But it's not about their political affiliation or whatever. It's just that E5 and E4 and E6, instead of being 19 years old, he's probably 27 years old, and she's probably got a child, and they probably have 10 or 12 years in a civilian career. And there's just a different thought process that they bring to their skills as members of the National Guard and interacting with the public. And it's no different. And even when those same members of the National Guard are deployed forward in a theater of war, there's still some intrinsic benefit to having an E4 that's 30 years old as opposed to an E4 that's 18 years old. It's just a different type of formation, and they bring different sets of skills with them from their civilian careers and their civilian life, and just the overall experience of living that life. So yeah, I think there is some unique things about members of National Guard formations, more about their experience and their age and where they are in their own life. The second part of that, and I'll be brief, I spent most of my life in uniform. Um, I'm in some different circles now in some of these discussions. I think there are a lot of people out there that maybe don't understand that the members of a formation in the National Guard could care less what color you are, where you're from, who you sleep with, what your history is. They just don't care. It's not a bad thing. It's just that they don't care. They just want you to come in, learn, perform, and do your job. That's all. It's just like you had in the Marine Corps when you were 19 years old. You never thought about the man or woman sitting around you, what they were thinking. You were just thinking about this is a job we got to do. You didn't care where they were from. You didn't care their economic status. They were just a part of your team. I say it all the time when I go out and speak. If I was advising a young person of any race, color, creed, religion, origin, any of them, if they're looking for a place where they can be judged less than anywhere else in the employment world, the National Guard is the place. We don't have to, a lot of times people want to design formations and bring us into public format with certain, hey, we want so many minorities here. We want to make sure that all the sexes are represented. We don't have to, because it happens that way naturally in the National Guard, because they all come to be a part of it. So yeah, I think there are some unique things about the National Guard that make us a little bit better maybe at some of the domestic missions.
Yeah, and I think that's the point you raised at the end about, not caring. I think that is true in the military. The military is a unique place in that. I'll tell one anecdotal story, but I don't want to go too deep into this topic. But when I was in the Marine Corps, I knew a white Marine from the Deep South whose family had been members of the Sons of the Confederacy, and he became great friends with a Black American Marine from Mobile. So that story is possible in the U.S. military. You don't see that story that much outside of the military. And I think the military is a bridge for Americans, and that's why I think more Americans should serve probably. And I always say the most equal place in the world in terms of representation is a military cemetery. All the graves are equal. It doesn't matter what your rank was. It doesn't matter what you did. That's a place where all sacrifices are treated equally.
The only thing I would add, Adam, is not only is it possible, you said that's possible, that kind of relationship, that's the norm. That is literally the norm. And I think people outside of our formations have trouble getting that through their minds. No, that's great. Thanks for the story. That's perfect.
I'm gonna go to, does anyone else want to weigh in on any of this?
Adam, just one other perspective to build on what Dr. Weiss and Roy were saying is because we make up a cross section of our community, we're a part of our community. So that's one of the great benefits to the National Guard performing those domestic operation missions if there's civil unrest or if there's during COVID, if there's a food bank that needs to be staffed, if there's a hurricane and neighbors need help, we're your neighbors. We're your doctor. We're your lawyer. We're your plumber. We're your barber. We're your kid's school teacher, right? So we're part of the fabric of the community. When you compare that to the active component, and I love my active component brothers and sisters, I used to be part of them. But when you compare that to the active component, they're not necessarily that embedded in the community. They're in a cloistered uh, military facility somewhere, usually on the outskirts of town. They come and they go. If every airman on Luke Air Force Base left town last night, I'd have no idea because they're all behind these big cloistered walls. But if your kid's school teacher goes and your barber goes, you're gonna know. So that's a tremendous benefit to the National Guard, is we are part of your community. So when we're out there trying to protect the state capitol or buildings or make sure folks get food and water, we're protecting our neighbors. That's our state capitol, right? Those are the buildings that our tax dollars paid for. So I think that's a tremendous benefit of the National Guard.
Yeah,
I
and if
want,
I oh, go
I
ahead.
was, I was just gonna throw in one more quick thing. One of the things we're working on here at the center now is looking at the COVID response in Mississippi by the National Guard. It was largely the National Guard that, especially in senior centers and old folks' homes, delivered those shots. And it'd be one thing if the Marines were giving you those shots in a state that is probably not that trusting of vaccines. Mississippi is probably one of the highest ones, but it was your neighbor. It was a person you knew. It was again, as the general was saying, it's your preacher. It's the guy down the street. You knew you could trust him. And so that trust had a big part in helping Mississippi get past that.
Yeah, there's also a reason the Marine Corps have Navy corpsmen. I don't think I'd trust a Marine to give me a shot anyway. Um, but if I could add something, I think a weakness of the regular military and the active component is also that sometimes this progress that's made in sort of intercommunal understanding, sometimes that exists on the base, that exists when you're deployed, but sometimes that does go away when folks leave and they go back to their towns and cities. And, unfortunately, not all of that progress is sustained. Whereas I do think in the reserves and the National Guard, because people are staying in so long and at the same time that they're in the military, they're existing in their communities, some of that understanding actually filters into society probably at a higher level because it's not as compartmentalized. um, I'm going to ask another question from the chat. Well, okay, first of all, someone asks what's the difference between the guard and the reserve. I think I could answer that, but I'll let one of y'all answer it because it will be a better answer. um, so let's start with that and then we'll go to the next question.
I can jump in, and I'll phone a friend with Dr. Wiest if I screw it up. So the Guard, as we discussed, is your state militia dating back to the 1600s. We're under the command and control of the governor unless we're federalized by the president. The reserves are federal troops. They're federal. There's a Marine Corps Reserve, there's a Navy Reserve, there's Air Force Reserve, Army Reserve. Those folks are federal troops. The body of law that creates them and controls them is Title 10 of the United States Code. The body of law that creates, well, the Constitution creates the National Guard, but the body of law that controls the National Guard is Title 32 of the United States Code. So the reserves are always federal. They are never under state command and control. They're always federal. They're an arm, a reserve arm of the federal military. The National Guard, by design, by nature, we're almost always state unless the president flips the switch and calls us to active duty.
If I could add to that too, Adam, I think one of the things that draws some of those young people to the National Guard specifically, as opposed to the reserve, and I love my folks in the reserve, but if there's a hurricane or a flood or a tornado or any other type of catastrophic event in your hometown, in your village, in your city, and in your state, the people who are going to be able to respond in a state status are members of the National Guard. And they're the only really dual status military formation that exists not only just in this country, but in the world. There are countries all over the world that would give anything to have something that could replicate the National Guard that we've grown here in the United States. But the truth is, a lot of them, and that's the reason that you have generations of people who continue to serve. You may have a father and children serving in the same unit at the same time, or a mother and children serving. And that's because they want the ability to respond to their neighbors and their families and their towns and cities and villages in those great times of needs whenever we have catastrophic events.
Okay, thanks for that. We have a question from the chat that I think strikes at some of the themes we've been talking about, but is current. And someone asks, could the president order a state National Guard to help ICE with in-state deportations overriding the governor if the governor was opposed to that, and they follow up with, is the Montgomery Amendment or the court decision regarding Illinois relevant? So whoever wants to have at that.
I could jump in on the first part of it. I'm not familiar. I probably am familiar with the court decision in Illinois, but I'm in my mid to late 50s, so I've probably forgotten about it. But I can say, yes, the president could federalize the National Guard to assist ICE. It's a big, heavy political lift if you're going to do that, to actually go out and arrest people, use the National Guard in uniform to go out and arrest people. So there'd be great debate over that. But could the National Guard legally be mobilized under Title X authorities to assist ICE? Yes.
If I could add to that, just kind of as an addendum. So what Joe Connolly says, he's the legal expert and he knows all the statutes and he can have these kind of discussions. But as far as from the command side, it's not so much that the Guard can be mobilized to assist ICE or any other federal entity. It's not about the entity that they're assisting. It's about the task that they're being asked to perform during that federal assistance. And I think that's where there seems to be some confusion on occasion, because there are some limitations that a member of the National Guard, even in a Title X status, has limitations on that they won't be able to do. But it's more about the status and what they're being tasked with than it is the organization that they're supporting. Joe Connolly, you agree with that? Does that make sense?
I totally agree with that. And that's, Roy said it more clearly than I did. That's what I was alluding to when I said, depending on what you were doing for ICE, that's where the political rubber would meet the road. So if the National Guard was mobilized to perform administrative tasks in assistance of ICE, if the National Guard was mobilized to provide transportation assistance to ICE, that's probably not going to be that controversial. And you can see historically that's the way we've been used on the border to assist Customs and Border Protection. We don't like to go down there for the purpose of putting hands on humans. We typically go down there to expel the federal agents from their administrative and logistical work so they can surge their badged civilian officers to the border. In this case, to expel all those ICE agents that might be performing administrative and logistical tasks. We might go in, take over those tasks so they can put more badged civilian officers on the street, because that's the construct that this country wanted. As Dr. Wee said earlier, we don't want a large standing army out there doing police work. We want civilians who are badged, trained civilian law enforcement officers out there doing the police work. So if we can go in and do a job that frees them up to do those police functions, that's going to be less controversial than if you have us trying to do some of those police functions. And then that brings in posse comitatus and all those, all that body of law as well.
Adam, if you don't mind, I'll weigh in too, because the question brought up the Montgomery Amendment. And again, I'm not a legal scholar. Again, I wish our legal scholar was here, because I'm sure she could talk about this for a good long time. But in '86, President Reagan sent some National Guard units, federalized them, and sent them to Honduras for training. A series of blue state governors felt training was more within their purview, and of course, this is international training, not local training. So they tried to recall their troops, and there was a federal case before the Supreme Court, the Perpich case, that decided that even though the Montgomery Amendment had, quote unquote, decided this, the Perpich case backed that up, that the president in this case still had that power. So that was the Montgomery Amendment that was being referred to. And again, I'm not a legal scholar, but it certainly seems from my reading of the history that the president would have that right. It's up to every American to decide whether politically he ought to use that right. That's why you get a chance to go vote in the fall. You get to make sure that you're holding the government's feet to the fire politically. but the president does legally seem to have that power, historically speaking.
Well, thanks for that. And I actually think sometimes it helps not to be a legal scholar when explaining laws. Uh, but and I say that as an attorney myself, definitely not a legal scholar. Um, so we have two more questions I'm going to ask, and we have about maybe 4 or 5 minutes left. One question I'm going to direct right back to you, Dr. Wiest, which is uh, somebody who says they're a Vietnam vet says that the thinking during the Vietnam War was that if you joined the Guard and Reserves, it was a way to avoid going to Vietnam. Is that an accurate assessment, or was that rumor mill?
Oh, that's entirely accurate. It was made. The decision was made by and large that there were a very few tiny Guard formations that were sent to Vietnam. The decision was made to not call up the Guard and Reserves, in part because the international message that would send to the Soviets is that we're mobilizing as a country, and in the world of limited war in the nuclear age, that's not something we wanted to do. But of course, just to build on that, something that'll take far too long, but that resulted in one of the big sea changes in what the Guard is. Our second commander in Vietnam, actually our third commander, but second major one, General Creighton Abrams, decided that that's one of the reasons we did not succeed in Vietnam, is that we didn't call up the National Guard, which is the connection between the military and the people. He felt that was the reason, that the people had at best been indifferent to that war, perhaps even hostile. So he brought in a series of changes that are loosely called the total force policy, that essentially meant in the future, when America goes back to war, it will take the National Guard. A little bit squishy on that in the Gulf War in '91, but in general, the Guard has become a much more kinetic and much more battle-focused instrument than it had ever been before, which is a big change to what the National Guard is training and rotations. In this case, it's cycles of battle overseas. That's a big part of what it means to be a Guardsman today.
Okay,
And
thanks.
Adam, one thing that the participants might not know is in the early 90s, there was an agreement made between the Army components, the active duty, the Army Reserve, and the Army National Guard, to put all of the combat arm capability, the reserve combat arm capability, in the National Guard. So when the United States goes to war now, the capability for the Army, at least, the combat arms capability for the Army, at least, a great mass of it is in the National Guard. So you have to take the National Guard if you're going to fight a war these days.
That brings us to our closing two questions, which I'm going to ask as one, and maybe we can have a flash round of answers since we're really low on time. Somebody asked, do you think the National Guard relies too much? I'm sorry, do you think the nation relies too much on the National Guard for global operations? And does this threaten the part-time construct of the National Guard? And this person says that part of the Laird Act was that the nation couldn't go to war without the National Guard being mobilized, and this would serve as a break on going to war. Has this worked as planned? And then a second individual, which I think is related to this question, references a grassroots initiative called Defend the Guard, which would require a declaration of war by Congress per Article 1 of the Constitution in order to deploy them to combat in foreign conflicts. And do you think this has gotten why do you think this has gotten traction in conservative states, and do you think there's legs to it? So whoever wants to answer either of those two questions, the floor is yours.
I'll jump in on that first part really quick. With the nearly constant deployments, I mean, we forget that we don't forget, but the war in Afghanistan was old enough to vote. So there were constant deployments. And in that world of constant deployments, that really put pressure on the Guard. Some of the Guard guys I studied were deployed 5 times, and that's a lot. I mean, that puts pressure on the very fabric of the Guard. Of course, however, in a shorter war, that the new nature of the Guard wouldn't be nearly such an issue. But I'm gonna leave that to the professionals.
So the only thing I would add is I think really two things. I think the current operational National Guard gives an opportunity for people who would not serve in the military to come in and serve in the National Guard and serve their nation and their state. and do it in a way where they expect to be mobilized and deployed as opposed to just being in the unit for 20 years. And I think that's good for the nation. I think it gets more of our young people involved. And the second part of that is, I think having a National Guard that's more focused on operational level, both air and army, it also is another place for all of those highly trained, very capable young people who come out of the active component to come into the National Guard and do it as a part-time soldier or airman, be it pilots, whatever the case may be, and continue to serve their nation in a professional organization that still, if the nation needs to call on them to go to a theater of war, they'll be prepared to go and do their service. So I think there's some real advantages there that maybe we don't always recognize.
Adam, I'm happy to jump in on Defend the Guard. I am a tremendous opponent of Defend the Guard. And I can tell you that the Adjutants General Association of the United States is against it. All 54 commanding generals of every state and territory's militia is against it. National Guard Association of the United States is against it. The Enlisted Association of the National Guard of the United States is against it. And the reason for it is, one, it's unconstitutional. As Dr. Wiest was describing the Perpich case out of Minnesota, that Supreme Court opinion made it very clear that the president can flip the switch and mobilize the National Guard to go train overseas, even over the objection of a governor. There's some cases much earlier in our history, Supreme Court case called the selective draft cases that also recognizes that the president can federalize the National Guard over the objection of a governor. And then most recently, we just saw what happened in California and in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in Newsom versus Trump, that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the most liberal circuit in the country, said that the president can flip the switch and mobilize the National Guard over the objection of the governor. So what Defend the Guard seeks to do is to pass state laws that say the governor can't let the Guard be mobilized overseas without a declaration of war by Congress. Well, once the president flips the switch and says you're going overseas, the governor has no control over the Guard. It's a foolish law. And what it does is it puts in jeopardy whatever state is the first one to pass it, and it's failed in 31 or 32 states so far. Whatever state is the first one to pass it is essentially raising their hand and saying, hey, I'm going to take a knee and I'm not going to do my overseas duty mission. And guess what's going to happen to that state's militia and their funding and their equipment? It's going to get shifted to a state who will do it. So it's tremendously dangerous in terms of the national security of this country, and it's foolish because it's on its face unconstitutional.
So basically, if you want to have congressional oversight, you can have it, but it has to be at the federal level. You can't sort of bring it down to the state level.
Right. When we join the National Guard, we also join the National Guard of the United States, which is a federal entity. We swear two oaths at the same time, one to the president and the Constitution of the United States, one to the governor and the Constitution of our state. So we're in these two overlapping entities the entire time you're in the National Guard. And as soon as the president says, hey, California, I'm mobilizing part of your Guard to go to the streets of Los Angeles, boom, they're no longer in the National Guard. They're no different than a soldier on Fort Benning, Georgia, Fort Hood, Texas, Osan Air Base, Korea. They're no different. The governor has no control over them, just as the governor has no control over any other federalized troop.
Hey, Adam, I'll weigh in with one thing really quickly here. I think that's a much bigger systemic question about how America fights its wars. Well, we haven't declared war since 1941. Every war we fought since then has been under some lesser congressional authority. I'm a firm believer in that the constitutional framers probably got it right, that Congress has a deep and important duty to declare war, but in the past 60-something years that they haven't done it. They've abrogated that authority to the president, which has not always worked that well for us. So that's a much, much bigger question than the Guard's slot in that big war that's being fought.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you on that, and I agree that it is probably a bigger question. We're gonna have to leave it at that. And I want to thank everyone who joined and posed questions. I want to thank the University of Southern Mississippi's Center for the Study of the National Guard for co-hosting this and co-organizing this with us. I want to thank those who have served on this panel for your service and those who are still serving for your continued service. And I know you all are very busy, so it's a great honor to have your time for actually over an hour. And before we leave, for those who are still on, if you want to tune into some upcoming panels, please go to the Quincy Institute's website. Just Google Quincy Institute. You can find our event page. We have a book talk on Iran's social and political evolution coming up on June 30th. We have another book talk on on King Abdullah of Jordan and his life trajectory coming up on July 10th, and on July 23rd. We have yet another book talk on Iran's rise and rivalry with the U.S. in the Middle East. But I can guarantee you these book talks won't be boring. And if you don't have time to read a 350-page book, these talks are a great way to get all the major takeaways without doing that. So please tune into other panels, and we will have future panels for the Veterans and Foreign Policy Initiative. And we're going to try to get to the tough questions of what it means to be a veteran today in America, and what it means for our policies to have veterans at the table. So I thank all of you for joining today.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, y'all can go. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, sir.
General, you just have to hit leave at the bottom right if you want to leave, or I'll just end it for everyone.